Welcome everyone to this online lecture by Vanessa Jones, new Curator of Dress of the Rijksmuseum. Thank you for being here. We managed to figure it out technically wise. What I'll do now is I'll spotlight you for everyone so everyone can see you full screen. We'll do the questions at the end, but people can just ask them in the chat throughout. We're very much looking forward to what you have to share with us. So I'll give the floor to you.
Great, thank you so much. I am so sorry that I'm now running 15 minutes late for this. How ridiculous. But are we good? Can you see that? Hopefully.
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to apologise for the last time that due to me being terrible with technology, that we're now running 15 minutes late. So thank you for bearing with me. Okay, yes. So today I'm going to be talking about current projects and future plans at the Rijksmuseum. And I thought to begin with, actually, I would kind of introduce myself to you all. A lot of you I am yet to meet, and as you will probably know, I am not only new to the Rijksmuseum, but also new to the Netherlands. So I thought that might be a nice kind of way to start. So I have been at the Rijksmuseum since February this year, but I was working at a local run museum service for 5.5 years in Leeds called Leeds Museums and Galleries. And that was the largest kind of consortium of museum services run by local council. So we had 9 sites and I was across all 9 of those sites doing dress-related things as the dress curator there. This was the image that you have on screen was probably my favourite exhibition that I curated whilst working at Leeds Museums. It kind of encompassed everything that I love about dress history. So being able to show women's history through the biography of the wearer or the biography of the maker, as well as combining that with consumption practices. So fast, slow fashion looked at the consumption of clothing in Leeds and the wider Yorkshire area from 1720 to 2020. And it was really an opportunity to consider the similarities, but also the differences in the ways in which women and also men consumed fashion or clothes throughout these periods. I was working at Leeds part-time, and so spent a lot of time working within academia and teaching, predominantly history, history of art, history and fashion design students. But I was also kind of a consultant and a freelancer. So this was one of the exhibitions that I worked on towards the end of my kind of stint in working in the UK, which was the Bring No Clothes exhibition at Chelston Trust. And this really kind of encompasses contemporary fashion alongside early 20th century artwork. So this really multidisciplinary exhibition. I have taken, as I'm sure many of you have also done, taken various strange paths on my career to date. And yeah, I started out actually training at the V&A, and I was there on and off for a number of years. I'm showing this image because it was probably the funnest exhibition that I worked on. It may not have been the biggest project that I worked on at the V&A, but certainly it kind of opened my eyes to the way that we can use science in the way in which we curate dress. And so when I was kind of helping out with the Balenciaga show, one of the things we did and I assisted with was making these really iconic, really beautiful x-rays. And yeah, it just made me kind of think a little bit more about the way in which we examine the way we look actually at garments and what that reveals. A question that I often get asked is, what did you study? So I did, I will tell you, I did my master's in history of design and material culture, where I specialised in dress objects from the early kind of 20th century, and also surrealist art, which was, a different time. And I actually have a BSc in geography, which I think is where my kind of interest with consumerism really comes from, actually. So that's kind of a very brief introduction to me. But yeah, I think we're all here to know what I'm working on at the moment. So I can't tell you everything that I'm working on at the moment, but certainly there's a few projects that I can focus in on a little bit more within this half an hour kind of time slot. So one of the things that I am working on alongside the conservator Marjolein from the Rijksmuseum is a weighted silk project. Marjolein has been working on this for quite a number of years, and she has been kind of building up knowledge around weighted silk. Weighted silk was something that happened in Europe predominantly, but it actually has a much, much longer history. We've always kind of weighted silks and materials. But certainly the kind of specific period that we're looking at is from the kind of 1880 right up until 1930, when weighted silk was really kind of prolific in the fashion industry. Marjolein's kind of created a database of all of the weighted silks in the collection at the Rijksmuseum. We've recently also just done XRF, which I'm not a scientist, so I'm not entirely sure how it works. But we're able to better understand what these objects are made of and what they have been weighted with. So whether it's tin, whether it's zinc, whether there's other things in there as well, and why that is kind of having this shattering effect on the silk. My kind of involvement is not from a scientific angle, of course. I am merely here to kind of contextualize the weighted silks within this broader project. And to understand the consumer's kind of material literacy of these objects and of the textiles that they were buying. So did people know from feel or from smell that things were weighted? And if they did, what does that mean for the way in which they consumed? Similarly, another kind of project which I have literally only just started on is a purple dye project working alongside Willemijn, again from the conservation at the Rijksmuseum and colleagues at UvA. This specific project looks at 19th century purple dyes and the changes that potentially the dye can have on a textile garment, particularly women's dress objects. And again, much like the weighted silk project, I'm kind of there to contextualize this. So what is the difference between purples that are synthetics or organic, for example, from the beginning of the century to the end of the century? However, the biggest kind of project that I think I am talking about today is Suit Yourself. So Suit Yourself is going to be displayed, not a huge exhibition in the Philips Wing or anything like that, is in the Kostuumvitrine in the special collections. And Suit Yourself specifically looks at menswear from 1750 to 1850. But for this show, I think it was really important that I wasn't just retelling the same narratives. There's obviously been a lot of shows on menswear recently, the V&A being the biggest one, but also over in the US, there's been a few, and in Manchester, and now obviously the Met has just announced they too are doing an exhibition about menswear, but from a very different perspective. And so for this show, I really wanted to not kind of avoid telling the same kind of European fashion history narrative. It would kind of be too easy almost. And so with this, there's kind of three key areas, of which today I'm only talking about two. So the first one is to really showcase Dutch fashion history and really tell the Dutch story of 18th and kind of 19th century garments. The next is to diversify the stories more broadly and the kind of narratives that we're telling, kind of away from the white elite. Although those objects are obviously the ones that we find in our collections more so than not. And finally, the other thing, which I won't have time to talk about today, is the focus on women embroiderers, who obviously were working up these waistcoats and embroidering them, but rarely do we shine a light on them. So when I came to the Netherlands, I kind of realized that there hadn't been that much written about Dutch fashion from a Dutch perspective. Valerie Steele, quite a while ago in 1985, wrote The Sober Dress of the Dutch. Now, this sounds like I may be taking this out of context, but in her essay about the macaroni, she describes Dutch fashion as being sober from the 17th century right up until 1760. And this narrative is kind of continuously told about Dutch fashion and Dutch fashion history, when actually in reality it isn't true. And we know that from the collections that we have. And for some reason there's this rhetoric around this, and we see kind of French history and we see, English history, but actually what we mean by that in terms of fashion is really only looking at Paris and London, and everything else kind of gets forgotten. And so within this exhibition, I really wanted to showcase that this is not the history of Dutch fashion history. It's not sober. And yeah, we know that from objects in the collection. So I'm not going to focus on all of the objects because there's too many, but I thought I would pick a few to showcase for this talk tonight. So the garment on the left is incredibly interesting. So it's from around 1745, potentially up until about 1750, sorry. The first thing that is very apparent with this garment is the colour of it. And this is inspired in part by what Delft was producing and the exports it was making in terms of its blue and white porcelain, which were then obviously, inspired by China. But what's more interesting to me about this is this kind of cardboard, I'll show you, I hope you can see that cursor. There's cardboard with lines. Well, it's actually between the lining and the embroidered silk that lies above it. And the V&A have commented on this, and they describe how this is to kind of shape the torso, which it absolutely does. And we see how men in this period are very conscious and very aware of their bodies. And this is kind of seen through such adaptations in their garments. But what I find really interesting about this is that as far as I'm aware, we don't know where this kind of comes from, but there are various, they're not extensive. We don't have huge collections of this, but there are a few examples. And what is really interesting is that describing earlier silks, I can't remember what the person's name is. They write it in the 1770s about, the kind of silk damask industry. And they talk about this stiff as a board. So the fabric that is being produced is incredibly stiff. And I just think I need to do more research into this, but there seems to be this link between stiffening the fabric, which the Dutch seem to be doing. And I think this one is Dutch. We have not we personally as in the Rijksmuseum, but Collectie Nederlands has another very similar waistcoat to this one, which has a very strong Dutch provenance. And this is the other thing as well about dress history, as I'm sure you know, it's sometimes really difficult to pin down where an object is from, especially if you don't have strong provenance. But certainly with the case on the left, I think it probably is Dutch. The waistcoat on the right is, Bianca de Motier has talked about this a lot. And rightly so, she discusses the threads that are used on this garment. And again, we see how the pattern, the embroidery is inspired by you know, somewhere else, a different point in time entirely. This is very, very similar to English crewel work from kind of the late 17th century. However, the colours are completely different. And those women who are doing that crewel work are inspired by the Palampurs, the Indian Palampurs that are being exported. But why this colour combination? And I don't know. I think from looking at it more closely, to me, it kind of feels like someone wanted to almost mute down the tones of a Palampur. On a Palampur, you do see this kind of red colour, but it is strange that grey has been used. And so perhaps instead of using these much more vibrant colours, they've decided to tone it down. But that's as much as I can tell you at the moment about this one. But certainly, if this is Dutch, it also shows how, you know, how the sober Dutch fashion before the 1760s just doesn't really ring true. Oliver Goldsmith was a writer, and he was studying in Leiden in the 1750s. He was from Britain. There are various accounts such as this. This is just one example. And he speaks of the Dutchman in this period. And he says that everything imitates a Frenchman, but in his easy, disengaged air. Now, at this time, there was a lot of talk around, you know, how countries saw one another. Very kind of stereotyping, but also being very, very general in their approach to describing other countries. Germany speaks about the Dutch in the 18th century, as does France, as does England. And to me, this is really interesting because it shows that, yes, the Dutch were inspired by the French, but they were doing it in their own way. And I think that's what's so important about Dutch fashion, is that even if we go, I will go back actually, even if we go back and look at the selection, it's not the most loud in colour, apart from this red, obviously, Hemsrock, which I'll come back to, but it's not the loudest of fashions. And I think this kind of sums up what people in the city, in the kind of bigger cities with kind of production and manufacturing going on, would have been seen to wear. I also think as well, Bianca talks about this relationship between the Dutch, the French and the English, and this almost like this triangulation of transmitting information. And I think we very clearly see that here. The Dutch are influenced by the French, but in their very, very specific and own way. You can't really talk about menswear in this period without focusing on the macaroni. And actually that is where my kind of journey started when I was thinking about this display. But then soon realised that actually we don't really have that much stuff, that many objects that really highlight the macaroni. And I think that's because the Dutch were doing the macaroni, but in a very different way. This is a print from the 1770s. And the kind of term macaroni was first used in around 1764. And it was really a way to kind of, be the leader of fashion, be the most extravagant that you can be. And it was in opposition to the more not casual, it was still very formal, if we were to look back on these garments, but certainly they were not as patterned, and they were perhaps more muted or more kind of sober. And this kind of started happening in about 1760. But this was also the time that people were going on their travels and the Grand Tour. So in this period, whenever we hear about Dutch fashion, men's fashion, European men's fashion, we think of the macaroni, and we instantly are transported to Italy. All of these elite, predominantly white men going on their grand tours to Italy and being influenced by the, very flamboyant culture and the textiles that were being produced. However, that's not necessarily, well, that isn't really the case in the Netherlands. Men in the Netherlands actually didn't go to Italy. A few did. We know from ego documents, so things like travel writing and diaries and things, that a very small proportion of people did go to Italy, but not on the same scale that kind of the French and the English were doing. So the Dutch were actually going to England, maybe they were going to France, they were going to Belgium, they were going to Germany, but not really Italy. So already we have this disconnect in this kind of European fashion history narrative that just doesn't really ring true with what was going on in the Netherlands. Obviously, they were being inspired by the people that they then saw in France, in England, and those people that then travelled to the Netherlands. But certainly for a country who was predominantly Protestant in this period, it doesn't make sense really to go to Italy as a Catholic country. And so, yeah, we see this kind of moment where actually the narratives that we know around the macaroni and around men's dress and men's fashionable dress in particular in kind of later 1760s into the 70s just isn't really fitting in nicely with what was going on in the Netherlands. In saying all of that, whilst talking about muted garments, there are garments in the collection which are more flamboyant than others, and they perfectly kind of fit within the time scale for the macaroni. However, as I've already said, it's quite difficult to know, if you don't have strong provenance, to know whether or not these garments actually are Dutch or not. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do as part of this, but kind of a legacy project, I suppose, as part of this display, is to really understand the construction methodologies of Dutch makers, essentially, so tailors, but also dressmakers, because there are very clear differences in women's dress, actually, particularly in the 18th century. I'm yet to kind of figure out how to do that with the 18th century garments, but I'm sure there is a way. But here again, you see these, these are very flamboyant colours. On the left, you see a waistcoat that would have been worn underneath a banyan, so this would have been worn at home. And on the right, you see a court jacket. And in both instances, we see this clashing of colour. And actually, for the first time in men's fashion, we see that men want to be seen more so than women. And actually, up until this point, men have kind of dressed as a counterpart to women. They've shared the same fabrics. Whereas now, if you are a macaroni, or if you decide to kind of show off in this very flamboyant, very vain way, you kind of are going above and beyond in this period. Women's garments, for example, don't necessarily clash in this way. I mean, don't get me wrong, you'll probably pull up examples of women's dresses clashing. But there's a difference in the flamboyantness that is being portrayed and projected here. What I also find interesting, and I'm not going to try and read this, is that even though the Dutch weren't kind of producing fashion plates in the same way that the French and the English were in this period, and really ridiculing and kind of producing satirical prints of the macaroni, for example, as we saw in the previous print, they're still kind of they're still making fun of these young men who choose to dress in these more flamboyant ways. And this is from 1781. So we still see this kind of the othering almost of these flamboyant individuals. It might not be in the same exact way that the French and the British were potentially doing it in, but certainly there is an awareness that young men are dressing in certain ways, and women actually as well. So the other thing I really wanted to do with this was to focus on alternative narratives. One of the ways we can get that story in is by focusing on everyday garments, which, you know, some of the waistcoats and some of the other garments are more everyday, but certainly using the hemdrok is one of those ways. And what I find really interesting, and I want to find more of kind of a connection, I suppose, between regional dress and city dressing, I suppose, is this kind of this use of colour, is this use of pattern, because we don't necessarily think about that when we think of, you know, European fashion in the early part of the 18th century necessarily. And how does that therefore influence the way that city people are living and consuming these fabrics? The same from the same gentleman who's in Leiden, he speaks of what I think potentially could be someone wearing a regional dress. I'm not really sure. I don't know if people in Leiden would have been wearing this, whether they would have been wearing regional dress or not. I don't know. I'm not sure. But he describes someone wearing 7 waistcoats and 9 pairs of breeches. And again, we see this kind of satirical angle that people are saying when describing a dress. It's not that it's just happening in France or, you know, or Britain. People traveling see things that are unusual to them and they comment, just as everyone else is doing. But what I think is interesting about this is that no one's wearing 7 waistcoats, but presumably the thickness of these heavy silk damasks and breeches made of similar materials are causing a commotion when everyone else is kind of wearing silks. So this is, yeah, one of the things that I am going to be focusing on. Finally, the other thing that I really wanted to focus on a little bit is African individuals in the Netherlands in the 18th century. And this is predominantly because we don't often think of this narrative necessarily when we think of these sorts of garments. And this is certainly the case in de Graaf. In his estate records, we see that some really elaborate, really well decorated garments have been noted. And actually, I read kind of 5 years before and 5 years after 1788 to see what other estate records were saying. And actually, no one in Groningen, at least, which is where he was living, had elaborate clothes like this. And generally speaking, only maybe 1 or 2 of these estate records highlighted clothing to this level. So this is something else I really want to showcase. Obviously, we don't have his actual clothes, but certainly drawing attention to this narrative, although a very small population of people in the Netherlands were able to wear such garments. I think it's still important. And obviously this has to be done very sensitively, because he himself actually then got his money from enslaving individuals and through the slave trade. Okay, future projects, and then I'm nearly done. One of the things that I noticed when working on kind of pulling objects for Suit Yourself was that we don't have those stereotypical macaroni, for example, garments, such as the one on the left. But what I also recognised was that we have a really great collection of 18th century and 19th century dress, but then not so great in 20th century and nothing in the 21st century. And this is in terms of the collection policy and in terms of developing the collection at the Rijksmuseum. It's about filling gaps, but also potentially bringing newer objects into the collection based on kind of some of the objects that we already have. So if you went to Point of View, you'll recognise that there was a pink suit in that show. That pink suit is also going to be in this showcase. And so reflecting kind of historic objects that we have with more contemporary pieces. By the way, these are not probably going to make their way into the collection. These are just examples. finally, to continue on this kind of legacy of diversifying the stories that we tell in the museum, one of the things that I will be working on next year, hopefully, is developing a fashion tour of the permanent galleries through artworks, through sculpture. And instead, I mean, don't get me wrong, some of the objects, some of the paintings that I will focus on are of elite white individuals, but we have a rich array of other paintings and of other objects where we can tell slightly more diverse narratives. For example, these peasants, as I described in the 1661 portrait, what do their clothes say about them, and what don't they say? So yeah, I think that's me done. I apologize that I couldn't talk about kind of 1750 right the way through to 1850, but hopefully that has given you a bit of an insight into the exhibition and how diversifying kind of the narratives that we tell within that space will kind of continue on after the opening of the exhibition.
Thank you so much for that. So we already had some questions in the chat. So again, if people have more questions, I'll invite them all to put them in. So I'll start with a question from Jan, who asks, to what extent is the fashion image of Dutch men influenced by the general image that that foreigners had of the Netherlands? Did you find anything about that? Oh, I think now you muted your mic.
Oh, sorry, I did. Can you say that again? I feel like you said that so quickly. Sorry.
Sorry.
How do people? Sorry.
So, to what extent is the fashion image of Dutch men influenced by the general image that foreigners had of the Netherlands?
Historically, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think quite a lot, actually. I think the main thing is that we don't learn about Dutch fashion history. It's not part of the European story. And I was reading something earlier today, actually, about kind of the 4 cities of European fashion, and everyone else kind of just gets left behind. And I include kind of Germany within that, Spain to a certain extent, depending on what period you're looking at. And predominantly, I suppose it's because England and Paris in particular were not only exporting, they were importing, but they were also printing. So they were kind of getting messages out much faster, perhaps, than other places. But yeah, and so everywhere else is kind of forgotten now. When I didn't do a fashion history course, but up until recently, you weren't taught about Dutch fashion unless it was to speak about 17th century Dutch fashion, and specifically looking at the colour black, which is also kind of a generalization about what people wore in the Netherlands in the 17th century. So I think there's always these generalizations, and I think we always project certain narratives, I suppose. I guess I'm trying to I don't know, question those narratives a little bit more. Because certainly you can be influenced by French fashion and English fashion, as obviously the Dutch were, but you can still do it in your own way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna skip over Jan's second question for a moment. If we have time, we'll get back to that. So more of a personal question from Anne-Marie. What is, at least up to now, your favorite waistcoat in the collection of the museum?
That's a really nice question. I don't know. I think I try not to have favorites because then you just focus all your attention on it. But I do really love the second waistcoat that I showed with the kind of purpley red and grey embroidery. It's just a really interesting piece because it's really, really typical in one instance, but then like very, very strange and really quite unique in another. And actually I sent it to an embroidery colleague, Isabella Rosnap, who people may know from her socials, and to see what she thought. And she also thought it was very strange. So yeah, more digging needs to be done on that one.
Yeah, cool. Just, I think most people will know, but just in case people don't, then go to the Rijksmuseum website as well, because the high-res images are great, and I think also on that one you can zoom in a lot and really see the details a lot more. So, question from Katja, who says, very exciting news. As a tailor and embroiderer, I'm very excited to hear that there is interest not only in the garment as such, but also in the process of making it and the people behind it. My question is if there's any plans at the Rijks to display collections in bigger spaces rather than a special collections hall.
Yeah, really great question. I mean, I hope so. Yeah, I don't know. Watch this space, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. There are some ideas for bigger exhibitions. Whether or not they happen, I don't know yet. But yes, you will probably all be the first people to find out if a larger fashion exhibition does happen, because I think the last one was in 2016. So it's about time fashion was up there again.
Good to hear. We'll keep our eyes up. So one question from Nina, who says there's usually not that much attention to the buttons on garments in fashion exhibitions, whereas especially in the 18th century, there's been a lot of beautiful buttons. Do you have a reason for why that is, or?
I think it's it's a really nice question, because you're completely right. There are so many different types of buttons that could be exhibited. There are going to be some buttons that are exhibited in this showcase. In fact, yeah, the same ones that Point of View had, if you went to see Point of View. I don't know. I don't know the reason for why not. Someone just hasn't thought of it, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know. That could definitely be a focus of a smaller display, or yeah, it's a really nice idea. And I think actually brings in a completely different maker to this process. Like, obviously I was talking about the maker and the embroiderer in particular for this show, not so much the tailor. Rarely really do you think about the button maker. Sounds like a PhD in the making.
Much more work to do, much more to show.
Yeah, definitely.
As always. So Marnix asks, will the Rijksmuseum's textile collection showcase material culture of a transnational, non-Western working class nature, or evidence of diversity of bodies?
Yeah, great question. I mean, yeah, I hope so. I think at the moment the collection doesn't really show non-Western, the global majority, I suppose. We don't really have that many objects that reflect that, which is, I suppose, one of the issues with that in particular. But that doesn't mean that we can't collect objects. So, for example, one of the things that I would like to start collecting more of are exactly that kind of, objects that link to the Netherlands in terms of their colonial past, but perhaps aren't, for example, worn by the person colonizing. So there is space for that, and I do hope that we can, and I can, alongside the history department, start thinking about ways that we can collect those sorts of objects. I am all for exhibiting working class dress, and actually, one of the papers that I'm yet to publish, I'm still writing it, I've been writing it for about 100 years, is specifically about working class dress in the 18th century, and how actually we again have this narrative that objects in museums are purely from elite families, but actually that's not always true. I mean, for the most part, probably, but yeah, in my last job there were a handful of garments that we have really strong provenance for, and that was a working class, family, Quaker family. And yeah, so these do exist. We just need to find a way of reading these, kind of understanding how to read these garments correctly, so that we can suggest a working class narrative. And if we can't, we can definitely tell other stories about the working classes through the elite, whether it's the person that would have mended this garment, or whether it's, you know, what someone would have worn in a kind of, I don't know, estate home. So yes, I'm all for diversifying stories and diversifying bodies as well. So yes, I think, yeah, what I have always tried to do is diversify the stories that we tell. And the more kind of everyday they are, so the more focused they are on everyday things or making or whatever, people engage with more because it's closer to them, and people understand it more. In my experience, you know, of kind of displaying, and then feedback from visitors. So yeah, really great question.
Thank you. So Rebecca says, thanks so much for giving us a behind the scenes look at current projects and a taste of what's to come. You mentioned 18th century women's wear and differences you've noticed between Dutch objects compared to French and English, and the twin aspects of making and consumption. Do you think you'll be able to pursue these issues soon? And she says, well, as you might guess, I'd love to help. So.
For context, Rebecca, I don't know if she has actually moved to the Netherlands yet, but last time we spoke, it was before I had come to the Netherlands. Anyway.
Yeah. We've met up a couple of times.
Oh, have you?
I'm so familiar with it. So it's great that she could join us today.
Yeah. Yes, so that, I mean, from looking at English and French gowns in the UK and in France, there are differences between the construction of women's garments in particular. One of the things that I've noticed is the lining that's used, which is so interesting because most of the linings, sorry, I'm a big 18th century fan, if you haven't guessed. The linings that are used in not all of these garments, but some of these garments is definitely imported. And I think we might be able to trace some of that. And I think what's also interesting is that obviously with the VOC, the Netherlands is in such a strong position to utilise more fabrics and more of this type of fabric for linings. I don't know why they would have done this, but it's certainly not a common thing that is seen in UK collections unless it is Dutch. So yeah, but also in terms of cut, it is a little bit different. Yes, but in menswear, I'm not sure about menswear. I need to look at menswear in more detail.
Thank you. So I think sort of related to the typical Dutch thing, Petronella asks, are you going to study the traditional Dutch costumes in the time period as well?
Yeah. So I think one of the things with me including the hemdrok was to kind of show that there is another narrative and there are other fashions going on in the Netherlands. I have not in particular looked specifically at this, and I will call on my friends at the Rijksmuseum to help me with that. I would love to do something more broadly with this collection because when I first went into say CNL, for example, and I saw how much of this stuff that the Rijksmuseum have, I was quite amazed because the fabrics are incredible. And what's really interesting is that the fabrics that are used in these objects and then reused and reused and reused for years and years and years are used in such a different way in the Netherlands, in England and in France. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the chintzes or, you know, the silk damasks? It's so interesting. And there's, I want to do something, but I don't know what. But yes, the Rijksmuseum just are amazing and know so much about this and much, much more than I do.
So Karine asks, I don't know if you know or if you can share, but when will there be the next textile exhibition at the Rijksmuseum and what will it be about?
There at the moment there are no for a big exhibition. Do you mean there are no sort of plans for a big exhibition at the moment? When I know. I mean, there'll be a delay in letting everyone else know, but yeah, when there is one, you will know at some point.
Yes. So Titia says something different. Does the Rijksmuseum own any quilts, and will they on display at any time?
So this is a question for Sarah, who is the textile curator at the Rijksmuseum. We do have quilts, but that is literally as far as my knowledge goes. I don't know if they've been on display either. Presumably at some point. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure when they're exhibited. We do have some at CCNL though.
So I think it's just a thank you. So I think for everyone. So maybe a final question for me while everyone sort of thinks of final things to put in the chat. So the Rijksmuseum has a big collection, right? So what was it like to sort of come into that? Did you know anything about the collection before you started? How has it been to sort of discover what there is? Because I can't imagine it's a lot to sort of get to grips with.
Yeah. I think discovering is a good word to use. I was familiar with the collection, but not hugely. I've never studied the collection at the Rijksmuseum. I just know it from online and from, basically just online, from whether people are sharing images of the Rijksmuseum's dress collection or from the Rijksstudio. So yeah, it has literally been like an exploration of the garments that we have. And I feel like every time I go in to look for something, I find something else that I've not seen before. But this is always the way when you work with dress collections. It's only really if you're working on a specific project or if you have a visitor, for example, that wants to see something, that you really get to experience those objects for the first time and actually get to see them. But yeah, I mean, this first year I have kind of dedicated a bit of time to getting to know the collection. And yeah, it's an 8,000 piece collection, some of which is stored at CCNL in Amersfoort, and then some of it is here in Amsterdam. So yeah, it's been super exciting.
Cool. So maybe as a sort of a follow-up, because I know some museums sometimes do like they can bring out pieces for people who are interested. Are there any like plans or programs for that at the Rijks for students or for people who are generally interested? Does it depend on availability of people, or is it not really something you have the capacity for?
What, for visitors to see the collection? Yeah. We had I'm trying to think of people that we've had in recently. I had a colleague from UvA who came in to look at kind of muslin embroidered with embroidered with cotton or silk threads from India. I had someone from America come in last week who looked at fly braiding on 18th century dress objects. So yeah, if you have a kind of a research area, or if kind of physically seeing an object will, aid your research or aid, I don't know, your reconstruction, then yeah, that sort of thing can absolutely be facilitated.
Cool. It's great. Yeah. Great to hear. Thank you.
No worries.
So I think, so one final question. Oh, and just another one. I think we have a little bit of time if you don't need to run. So Katja says, I think I saw you wanted to do an Instagram profile for the dress collection in the Rijks. Is that still a plan?
I do, and I haven't done it because, it's on my to-do list. I will be doing it because I feel like I think there are people here that follow me, and it's basically just photos of dresses and then photos of my dog, which maybe people are there for that content. But yes, I would like to try and produce something slightly more official. Maybe in the new year. Maybe it could be my New Year's resolution.
Cool. Yeah. Well, if you do, let us know, and then
I
we'll
will,
make sure
yeah,
that the kostuumvereniging will share it.
Thank you.
Share
And
it
then
widely.
If no one wants photos of my dog, you can just unfollow my personal account.
Yeah. So we'll do that then. The final question for Martin.
Yeah,
Is the
sure.
Rijksmuseum partnering with any educational institutions during these projects to provide student opportunities?
Yeah. So we work with UFA which is specifically for the master's program. So people come and volunteer. Well, they don't volunteer; they intern for a year. This is something that we should, I think, be doing more of, and actually having kind of active working groups for certain things. So not necessarily about fashion, but about accessibility. For example, we do have someone working specifically for accessibility, but having steering groups and things like that are incredibly useful. And yeah, I know that for a few exhibitions that are happening next year, they have worked really successfully with a number of steering groups. So I think for the kostuumvitrine, it's a really small space. And so perhaps there isn't the scope to do this in this capacity, but certainly for the larger kind of Philip Wing exhibitions, there are steering groups and panels and things that we do work with.
So thank you so much for the talk. I think also for everyone in the audience for your questions. I think it was a very diverse set of questions, which is good to hear. There's a lot of interest in a lot of different things that you're doing. I think everyone will definitely keep an eye out on whatever is coming from the Rijks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the little peek behind the scenes.
Thank you.
And then with that, we will stop the recording and close the session and put it on YouTube. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. And again, apologies that we were 15 minutes late.
No worries. I think the talk definitely made up for it. Okay.
Thank you so much.
So have a very good evening, everyone.